Welcome to the weird part of YouTube. You know what I'm talking about. You start off innocently watching cat videos and then somehow, before you know it, it's 2 AM and you're watching something you need to delete from your internet history. Maybe you catch the reflection of your face in the computer screen and start to question what exactly it is that you're doing with your life. Relax, there's no judgment here. And this isn't a list of the most terrible things that happen in nature. I don't know what they are, but I'm sure you'll agree this list is quite terrible. I think we tend to have a rather idyllic view of nature, but after hearing what I'm about to tell you, the next time someone says, "Mother Nature knows best," perhaps you'll find it appropriate to quote Nick Bostrom and say, had Mother Nature been a real parent, she'd be in jail for child abuse. Perhaps the first thing that comes to mind when you consider the brutality of nature is the obvious fact that animals are eating each other. Now, how bad it is to be eaten depends a lot on the specifics. Lions will often go for the throat of their victim, breaking their neck or suffocating them, and jaguars will often kill their prey by clamping down on and crushing their skull. But not all animals are so lucky. Consider this deer who is slowly being eaten alive by an eagle. Hyenas eat their prey by tearing off chunks of flesh, piece by painful piece, and many species of snake swallow their prey while they're still alive. And while the inside of a penguin's mouth may, to a fish, look like something out of a fucking horror movie, being eaten by them might be a relatively quick way to die compared to being swallowed whole by a whale. For some unlucky animals though, it's almost as if their death were invented by a masochistic torturer. Consider the baby seals who have their eyeballs pecked out and eaten by gulls. Or consider this deer who's been bitten by a Komodo dragon. As they become weaker, the predators will begin eating them alive. Ugh, that is hard to watch. I can see that the deer is still clearly alive and suffering, even while having their organs ripped out. It kind of reminds me of that medieval torture technique where people will be hung, drawn and quartered. In fact, I've realised that there are many things happening in nature that seem analogous to medieval torture techniques. For instance, people would sometimes be skinned alive. Well, guess how bears sometimes begin eating fishes? Yeah, by ripping their skin off and eating that first. Now, obviously the bear isn't morally responsible for the harm they're causing to the fish. I mean, they lack the adequate theory of mind to understand the suffering they're causing, and obviously they need to eat to survive. But even so, a lack of malice on the bear's part is of no consolation to the tortured fish. One gruesome form of medieval execution was impalement. Now, surely that doesn't exist in nature. I mean, Mother Nature knows best. It's been suggested that some animals might not suffer intensely when being eaten because endorphins kick in when they're being attacked, but in many cases, prey animals can be seen struggling violently for hours. Perhaps this talk about endorphins is partly a psychological strategy to feel better about the suffering in nature, since the same point is rarely made about the inhumane slaughter of farmed animals. And this isn't just about physical pain, I mean, it's also about fear. Consider how terrified dogs can become by the sound of fireworks. Consider then how this young elephant is feeling while being chased by lions at night, or how a monkey feels when they're being chased by chimpanzees, who, if successful, will literally tear them apart. The misery that some animals are going through just isn't something I can do justice to with words, and so perhaps I'll give up on that and just move on to the next terrible thing happening in nature. Now, when someone talks of rivalry, it's hard not to think of Twilight's classic Edward and Jacob feud, but far more intense rivalries exist in nature. I know that's hard to believe, but hear me out here. Many animals fight over territory or mates, and that can lead to brutal injuries and even death. Many live in social hierarchies, and if you're at the bottom of that hierarchy, your life's gonna suck.
Anna is the troop's lowest ranked female. She's around 11 years old, has a distinctive red face, and has spent her whole life being last. Her lowly status is an unfortunate inheritance from her mother. There's no jackfruit breakfast for her. Instead, she forages for roots and grubs. She needs all the food she can find because she's heavily pregnant.
And some of them face complete exile from their group.
Tinky has driven 4 of her daughters out of the family. They watch forlornly from a safe distance. Life for them in exile is going to be tough.
I often hear people suggest that something is good because it is natural, but you know what's weird? Those same people won't let me eat their children, despite the fact that cannibalism and infanticide is common in nature. Consider this crab eating her own babies. Or this disturbing video of a stork attacking her young. And even if a young animal isn't attacked by their own parents, they're still in danger from unrelated adults of the same or different species.
One chick has fallen victim to a vicious assault. Although it's been blooded and is now severely weakened, the adult's attack is unrelenting.
Since resources are limited in nature, whenever an animal has multiple offspring at once, there's a chance of sibling rivalry. And one unfortunate consequence of this is often observed in birds, and it's called siblicide.
While she goes off to fetch water, it reveals a dark side to the relationship with its nestmate. It's 3 days older than the other chick and has always won the race for food and attention. This is more than just a scrap between two siblings.
One strange example that isn't technically sibling rivalry is the behaviour of the European cuckoo. The adult cuckoo lays its egg in the nest of a different bird species, and once hatched, the baby cuckoo will begin tossing other eggs or babies out of the nest. In doing so, the cuckoo receives all the food from the mother bird, while her babies are left to die alone below her. Nature isn't all doom and gloom. I mean, wild animals also get to experience positive things, like sex. And not just sex, but companionship. Some animals, like sea otters, can stay together for life. Now that being said...
Looks can be deceiving, yeah. Their sexual preferences are definitely tending towards rape. If they can't find a female around, they're gonna go for whatever's the right size, what looks right.
And what has been documented as looking right to a sea otter? Baby seals on occasion. In fact, sometimes the act is so rough, it ends up killing the baby seal or female sea otter.
Be it a seal or a sea otter, they actually take off the nose pad of the females, or will attempt to. They bite the nose really hard. It's just generally an aggressive event.
Now, if you still believe in God, take a look at the spikes on a cat's penis. The cat's barbed penis is thought to have evolved in part to prevent the female from escaping until the male has finished with copulation. Sex for female cats can be painful not just because of the spikes on a male cat's penis, but also because the male will bite the back of the necks and hold them in place. This kind of sexual violence and intimidation also happens in invertebrates too. Male water striders, when trying to mate with a female, will tap the water to attract predators so that the females will give in to them in order to avoid being eaten. Male diving beetles will violently shake females and hold them underwater so they're forced to submit to their sexual advances in order to avoid drowning. And once they've finished copulation, the males will guard the female for up to 6 hours to make sure that other males don't mate with them. And they do this by, you guessed it, holding them underwater, occasionally tilting them up for air so they don't die. What a gentleman. In some species of invertebrates, the mating process literally consists of the male piercing through the female's abdomen and injecting their sperm. This can leave an open wound that puts them at risk of injuries and death, and this process is known as traumatic insemination. And sexual violence is also committed by groups of males, which also puts females at risk of injury and death. So nature is widespread with examples of sexual violence, intimidation, and aggression. And being pregnant and giving birth won't be a walk in the park either, as illustrated by the fact that around 60% of hyena cubs suffocate in their mother's birth canal. In fact, for a hyena mother to give birth successfully for the first time, her birth canal must rip open.
A mom's pseudopenis actually has to rip for her to give birth successfully, which leaves behind a stretchy patch that does make birth easier the next time.
In summary, nature is beautiful, and it's hard to imagine how one might improve something so perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about parasites, and I don't mean my ex-wife. It's been estimated that around 40% of known species are parasitic, and there's a lot of variation in the different types of parasites. For instance, microbial pathogens are invisible to the naked eye and can cause disease, while other parasites are animals themselves, like ticks who live on the skin and hair of other animals. Some parasites can cause surprising behavioural changes, like consider this snail. After becoming infected, its eye stalks will mimic the appearance of caterpillars, and they've been observed to climb to higher and more sunlit places where they'll be more likely to be eaten by birds, causing the parasite to spread. Some parasites seem quite harmless, while another famously caused Charles Darwin to question the existence of God. And when you hear this next example, perhaps you too might ponder why a benevolent God would create such a process, or allow such things to happen. The tarantula hawk is a wasp that will sting its victim, but that's not the main issue here. I mean, how bad can a wasp sting be?
You alright?
Yep! Oh my gosh! Oh! Oh!
Okay. Tell me what you're feeling.
I can't move my arm!
Anyway, the tarantula hawk will sting its victim and cause them to be paralysed, but they won't die. Now, as someone who sometimes experiences sleep paralysis, I can attest that being paralysed is itself pretty unpleasant. But once the spider is paralysed, the wasp will drag it to a burrow, lay a single egg on its abdomen, before burying the spider alive. After 3 or 4 days, the wasp larvae hatches, digs into the abdomen of the spider, and begins to eat them alive from the inside, but importantly, avoiding all of the vital organs so that they remain alive for as long as possible, presumably to keep the meat fresh. After 2 to 3 weeks, the wasp emerges from the spider's abdomen to continue the life cycle. And by the way, this isn't an exception. For every tarantula hawk that exists, there is a spider who has died this way. But that's an extreme example, and it seems fair to say that most parasites don't cause such hellish scenarios. Consider sarcoptic mange, which is present in many mammals, including dogs and cats. It's caused by burrowing parasitic mites and can cause intense scratching, lesions, and crusting of the skin. Eyes and ears can become crusted over, causing blindness and deafness in the victim. Or consider canker, which is common in birds like doves, finches, and pigeons. It causes lesions in the throat, which makes it progressively harder to swallow, leading to starvation. Another extensively reported parasite in birds are gapeworms, which infest the trachea, eventually causing the victim to die from suffocation. The incredible scale and diversity of parasitism in nature makes it impossible for me to give what feels like an adequate summary here. But it seems fair to say that parasites are a significant source of misery for wild animals, and some of them are the stuff of nightmares. We tend to romanticize the lives of wild animals, but as we're seeing, their lives seem stressful. While living in our comfy homes, it's easy to forget that when a wild animal gets injured, they don't receive treatment. There are no social safety nets to prevent them from starving, no law to protect them from violence, and no emergency services to help them during storms or fires. So I mentioned before that wild animals suffer from stress when being attacked by a predator. But in fact, sometimes the experience of fleeing from a predator can be so intense that the prey animal dies of stress. And wild rats have been shown to die of heart attacks after being forced to listen to just a tape recording of a rat being attacked by a predator. When talking about the famous rewilding intervention at Yellowstone National Park, conservationist George Monbiot proudly proclaims,
"But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges."
This is what is known as an ecology of fear. The very presence of the wolves in the environment is stressful, causing animals to hide in places where the presence of predators is less likely, but food is more scarce. So in other words, prey animals are choosing to forego eating or drinking in order to reduce the likelihood of being attacked. But then they experience additional stress from the progressively worsening hunger and dehydration, which also makes them weaker and therefore more susceptible to predation. Anyway, the point is, the risk of predation causes continuous stress for wild animals, not just acute stress when they're being attacked. And fear of predators may cause lasting psychological damage. For instance, animals exposed to predators in a laboratory setting have developed symptoms that are reminiscent of PTSD. You know, to talk of stress in animals would once have been viewed as laughable, but now most people agree that animals display a wide array of emotions. But perhaps their capacity for emotional distress goes even further than you might expect.
A mother is holding her newborn young. It's dead. She is reluctant to let it go and has been carrying it around for many days.
This is Tiggy. She was on the brink of starvation last year due to her owners neglecting to give her food and water. I think we can all agree that this is terrible, and thankfully cases this severe aren't common. But in nature, starvation isn't the exception, it's the rule. Most species of animals reproduce in very high numbers. For example, turtles can lay thousands of eggs in their lifetime. So with that many children per parent, how can populations remain stable? I mean, why don't they just explode? Well, a big part of the answer is that a lot of them die when they're very young. There's only a small fraction who will grow up into adulthood and then reproduce themselves. Some of them will be killed by other animals, but one of the most common forms of death is by starvation shortly after being born. Babies are especially vulnerable to starvation, even in species that tend to care for their young. If a young mammal is prematurely separated from their parents, it's very unlikely that they'll find the food and water they need to survive.
The storm is now subsiding. But not all the elephants have been so lucky. One youngster has got lost. Thirsty and exhausted, it follows the tracks of its mother, but sadly, in the wrong direction.
Droughts are also causes of starvation and thirst.
The problem is that the absence of rain means grasses and other essential plants are not growing, and the animals that depend on them are dying from a lack of nutrition. Since the start of June, almost 60 elephant deaths have been recorded. More than half were calves killed by starvation because due to a lack of sustenance, their mothers stopped producing milk.
But starvation is happening at a massive scale all the time, which should serve as a reminder that to us, wild animal suffering is largely invisible. I mean, we don't see the young babies starving to death, and if we did, would we even recognize it, given that many animals hide signs of weakness to avoid attracting predators? And it's our ignorance of their situation that leads us to say things like, if fish are so smart, how come I can catch the same fish twice?
My simple answer to that is, imagine you're in the forest, you're lost and you're starving, and a hamburger drops from the sky. What are you going to do? You're going to grab that hamburger and shove it in your gob, right? I mean, that's what you're going to do because you're starving. And the reality is that wild animals are hungry all the time because there's simply not enough food to go around, right? We like to romanticize about the life of wild animals, but it's a lot harder out there in the real world than we imagine.
Have you ever wondered what it would have been like to live in the time before the advent of modern medicine? Before we had vaccinations and treatments to spare us from torturous diseases? This state that seems thankfully so alien to us is the situation of animals in the wild. Animals suffer from many of the same diseases that humans do, like tuberculosis, pneumonia, Ebola, and cancer. Invertebrates suffer from diseases as well, like Black Death in butterflies, which causes their bodies to decay while their insides liquefy, or cricket paralysis virus, which causes crickets to fall on their back and become paralyzed, taking several days to die unless they're eaten by another animal. And similar paralyzing illnesses are seen in other insects too, like flies and bees. One common disease that affects various animals is distemper disease, which causes fever, convulsions, paralysis, vomiting, and it's usually fatal. Many amphibians are susceptible to fungal infections which eat through their skin. eventually causing cardiac arrest. Lobsters are prone to lobster shell disease, which causes their shell to erode, making them more vulnerable to injuries. Another disease which seems really appalling to experience is rabies, which causes fever, burning sensations, pain, and paralysis. Since this disease can spread to humans, our companion animals, and farmed animals, we successfully eradicated rabies from Europe using oral vaccination programs. As I said, many animals have evolved to avoid showing signs of illness in order to avoid attracting predators, so we're likely to vastly underestimate the amount of disease being experienced in nature, as well as how bad it feels to experience it. Rabies, though, has been experienced by humans, so yeah, we're fairly aware of how bad it can be. And our success at vaccinating wild animals against rabies can encourage us to feel optimistic about protecting wild animals against other terrible diseases in the future. So we've covered a lot of different ways in which wild animals suffer, but there's so much that I haven't even touched on. So much that we might not even really consider because of the comforts that we take for granted. While we're sitting in our heated homes, it might be difficult to relate to wild animals who are having to deal with the ever-changing weather conditions. I mean, animals are literally freezing to death out there. And like with humans, even when temperature changes aren't fatal, they can still make you feel uncomfortable. And what about natural disasters? A single wildfire can kill millions of animals. And even if they manage to survive, they can still be left with burns, blindness, and breathing problems. During a fire, many animals like koalas will instinctively try to flee by climbing up trees, which isn't a good strategy in a fire. And some small animals will burrow into the ground. But if they don't burrow deep enough, then they will die when their dens heat up like an oven. Now, on a positive note, which I admit is rare in this video, during the Australian bushfires of 2019, hundreds of millions of dollars were raised to help animals, and some individuals even felt compelled to rescue animals from the flames, which I think illustrates our capacity to feel compassion for wild animals in need.
We'll get going in a second.
Now, if I had an accident, let's say I fell and broke my arm, thankfully I'd receive medical treatment. But imagine if this were not the case. Now, perhaps I'd be left with a permanent deformity, or chronic pain, or infections, or imagine if I'd had a particularly bad accident and were just left on the street to die. Well, this precarious situation is, of course, the situation of animals in the wild. Except it's worse than that, because wild animals rely on their bodies to avoid further harms. If you're a bird with a broken beak, then maybe you can't eat or drink. And if you can't eat, then you're weaker and therefore more susceptible to predation and disease and weather conditions and many of the other challenging things they have to face. As we're seeing, a lot of these harms are exacerbated by each other, and accidents are probably common. I mean, I've seen many birds with missing eyes, which can be caused by tree branches poking them in the eye. You know, when this happens, it's not like they're going to receive any pain relief or any treatment. Some forms of wild animal suffering are directly caused by humans, like fishing. I spoke to fish behaviour and cognition expert Cullen Brown to find out what it might be like to be a fish experiencing that.
The entire experience is, I mean, from any stretch of the imagination, is a horror show from start to finish.
Fishing is one of the many ways humans affect ecosystems today, and most of the actions that humans take on nature will have both positive and negative consequences. Now, whether we cause more suffering than we prevent will vary on a case-by-case basis, and it's often hard to evaluate, but obviously we should still try. Anyway, if you've made it this far, thank you. My hope is that you'll have a better idea of the reality that wild animals are dealing with. And this seems important. I mean, if we care about reducing suffering, then it's worth knowing that there is no place on Earth with more suffering than nature. The vast majority of suffering being experienced on this planet is being experienced by wild animals. And I'm sure many of you will agree that the situation of wild animals is terrible, but that still leaves many questions on the table. Are there things we can do, be that now or in the future, that makes it so that they suffer less? Is it possible to do so while being reasonably confident that we're not just making things worse? Well, that is all stuff that I discuss in other videos and will continue to do so in future videos. So be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you're interested in learning more. I want to take a moment just to thank my patrons who are making all of this possible. I am just so incredibly grateful that I get to spend time working on what I feel like is the most important stuff. And that's only possible because of the support of people like you who watch me. I really do feel so lucky that people are kind and trusting enough to give me this opportunity. So really, thank you so much. And if you're someone who isn't currently a supporter on Patreon, but you find my content valuable and you want me to keep doing it, then please consider doing so because it really makes a difference. I also want to express my gratitude to the non-profit organisation Animal Ethics, as their introductory article on wild animal suffering was just so incredibly useful when I was researching this video. Animal Ethics are one of the few organisations that focus on both farmed animal suffering and wild animal suffering, and I'll put a link to their website in the description for those of you who are interested in learning more about them and potentially supporting them. I also want to give a quick thank you to one of my long-standing patrons who I now consider to be a friend, and that's Tor, who has actually been working behind the scenes with me, helping me improve these video scripts, as well as helping me with making decisions about the documentary. You know, he's behind the scenes helping me make this content, but he's not getting any external validation from doing it. He's doing it because he cares about making the world a better place to live, and I just think that's really wonderful. So thank you, Tor. With that said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon with another video.